and thank you everybody for coming today. And we are actually in quite an extraordinary period of the economic history of the West, in that it's now said that millennials will be the first generation since before the Industrial Revolution that will be poorer than their parents. And this is increasingly looking not just like an anomaly. In fact, Generation Z, the following generation, are looking already to be even poorer. Now, in Britain, it's sometimes said this is the first time this is happening since the early 19th century. I think that was an anomalous period, really. It was the Napoleonic Wars and various other things happening. I think actually you can go back quite a few hundred years before you see this pattern, probably to the Renaissance, maybe even the early Renaissance, where you have this sustained decrease in living standards from one generation to the next. Now, there are a number of causes of this. Central bank policies have contributed, and I wrote a book on that, published by Springer Nature, which Barbara contributed to kindly, on how central bank policies have distorted the economy. Tomorrow I'm giving a talk in Budapest, talking through some of the other ideas, and then again on Friday, talking through some others actually. But nevertheless, regulation, the extraordinary amount of bureaucracy in Europe is a major factor in this. And also, I just wanted to say, like Richard said, I'm not coming here from Britain to preach, because Britain is at least as bad, and I think probably worse. In fact, I think Britain now has the worst exodus of entrepreneurs of anywhere in the world, certainly anywhere in the West. So first of all then, if we start to look at the cost of bureaucracy. Now, the European Commission says that the cost of bureaucracy in Europe is around 150 billion euros per year. But it's important to understand they're just looking at the quote-unquote administrative burden when they say that. So that's just the actual cost of people sitting around filling out forms, dealing with compliance, and so on. Now, even that figure is very low. The OECD have done a similar analysis of just the administrative burden, and it's more like 500 billion a year, or perhaps even more than that. But again, if we start to move beyond just this direct cost of people filling out forms, which is a very minor aspect actually of the complete cost of bureaucracy, the European Central Bank has said that roughly a third of the difference in productivity gains between Europe and the USA over the last 15 years or so, I think it is, are down to the amount of bureaucracy in Europe. Similarly, the McKinsey Global Institute has said that if Europe had matched those US productivity gains, the average household income in Europe will be 10,000 euros higher every year. Now, if we start to dig down into this a bit more then, into the actual cost in terms of the total GDP. In the USA, the National Association of Manufacturers worked with some academics to do quite a thorough study, and they came to the conclusion that 12% of GDP goes just on federal regulations in the US. That's just federal regulations, not state. Similarly, in 2005, in Britain, the UK Better Regulation Task Force, which was set up by the Tony Blair administration, found that around 10 to 12% of GDP every year goes on bureaucracy. Another approach to this came from the US economists John Dawson and John Seater, and this research is often cited in regulatory growth debates. And they estimated that all of the bureaucracy that's been added since 1950, I think it is, or around then, had that not been added, the USA will be 25% wealthier. Other people have said that's actually a significant understatement when you use the same data. But nevertheless, the World Bank actually backed this up. World Bank affiliated research said that, roughly speaking, countries moving from a high to low regulatory burden can experience long-run GDP levels 10, 15, 20% higher for sure. Now, if we again start to think about what this means for a company, the amount of time spent, the LFO Institute in Germany, which if I remember correctly, is attached to the University of Munich, but certainly a respected think tank, found that German workers spend on average 22% of their time on administrative tasks. And Germany is not particularly bureaucratic by European standards. If anything, it's one of the more pro-business countries. But then additionally, a survey by Visma Kantar of European entrepreneurs found that 55% of small business owners report spending more than 40% of their time on administrative tasks due to regulatory compliance and bureaucracy. So you think about what this means for the whole economy, all of this time being wasted. Now, it's often presented that sometimes wanting to reduce bureaucracy is a quote-unquote right-wing idea. Now, I don't like this right-wing, left-wing construct anyway, but it's just worth. I think this goes well beyond that. If it is indeed the case that, well over €1 trillion a year, conservatively, is being lost to bureaucracy, then that's also a lot of money that could be spent on environmental policies, social policies, or whatever else people might want to spend it on. So I think this is really an issue that everybody should be able to agree on, actually. And if we think then what it means for startups, I mentioned to start with that millennials are now the first generation for centuries that are poorer than their parents. One of the ways to predict how wealthy a country or region is going to be in another generation is the number of startups. And if we look at unicorns, for instance, that's the number of startups that attain $1 billion valuation or more. In the USA, there are 793. In the whole of Europe put together, including Britain, there are 135, of which 52 are British. In Singapore alone, that tiny island state in Asia, there are 22 unicorns. So that's 1/6 of the number of every country in Europe put together. If we look at the top 25 tech companies in the world, you'll see technology companies from USA, obviously. You've got Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and so on. You'll find several from South Korea, Samsung, LG, I believe Hyundai, perhaps more from South Korea. You've obviously got several companies from Japan and from China. There's only one company from the whole of Europe in the top 25 tech companies in the world. So this is how bad things are in Europe right now. All of this bureaucracy has essentially stifled innovation in Europe to a very large extent, and consequently we have these falling, or at best stagnant, living standards. But even if just outside of the tech companies, of the top 100 companies in the world, 70 are in the USA, around 50 to 20 are in Asia. Obviously it changes each year to a certain extent, but fewer than 15 are in the EU. And that's also from the McKinsey Global Institute. And if we look at the amount of wealth creation in the world over the last 15 years or so, measured crudely in stock market value, obviously a lot of that has come from these tech companies like Apple and so on. 80% of the global growth in net equity market has come from the US, and Europe's contribution has been close to zero, or arguably even negative in real terms when you take inflation into account. So quite an extraordinary situation. Now, how is this possible that we're managing to ruin so many small businesses in Europe that should be innovating? After all, it was only 20, 25 years ago that almost everyone I knew had a European phone. There was Nokia and so on. People were driving European cars. Well, according to Business Europe, regulatory compliance costs are around 1.5% to 3% of turnover for SMEs, small businesses, compared with below 5% for large firms. So in other words, there's a hurdle you have to jump over with this regulatory compliance costs, and that hurdle is a lot higher, relatively speaking, for small businesses. And consequently, the OECD find that high growth firms are around 5 to 6% of all firms in the USA, 2 to 3% of firms in Europe. 2% of firms are high growth firms. So again, this falling living standards that I'm talking about is pretty much baked into the cake now for the next generation, I'm sorry to say. The question then is, what can we do? And the first thing we need to be able to do is to assess the cost of all of this bureaucracy. So that's why I started my talk today with that. Again, the European Commission's measurements for the cost of bureaucracy are almost preposterously low compared to all of these other metrics which I've been giving you. Nevertheless, the European Commission says that they're going to have a real effort this time to reduce bureaucracy. What they're going to try and do is they're going to try and reduce administrative burdens in the EU by around 37 billion euros a year, 37 to 40 billion euros a year. Now you may say, well, that 37 billion euros sounds like a lot of money. But actually remember, Europe is something like a 20 trillion euro per year GDP. So this is a very small drop in a large bucket, really. And that's if the European Commission hits their goal of 37 billion euros cost savings. When has the European Commission ever hit any of its goals? And so really our starting point is not looking optimistic here. But if we assess for a moment what could be done without getting radical, without introducing any radical ideas, just fairly moderate reductions in bureaucracy. IMF studies have shown that moving from the OECD median level of regulation to best practice is associated with total factor productivity growth gains of around 0.2 to 0.4% per year. Now compounded, that's a lot of growth in productivity, and that's a lot of wealth creation. That would get the European economy going again. So we would start producing more tech companies, more businesses, and we would actually be back into a situation where each generation is at least slightly wealthier than the previous generation. Similarly, IMF cross-country analysis shows that aligning highly regulated EU service sectors with best practice regulation could raise sectoral productivity by around 15% over the medium term. I think that's the last of all these statistics I'm going to throw at you today from all of these alphabet organizations. But I think it's important to understand all these different perspectives on the cost of regulation and how we can turn it around. So it's really even just getting to something close to good practice regulations in the EU would probably get the economy going again. But it's important to think about then how to measure best practice regulations. If we talk about all of this bureaucracy, what are we actually comparing it with? Now, there's a few ways that this can be done. And if we're going to assess how to make Europe back into a growing, thriving economy, again, it's important to think about what we're comparing it to. Now, I mentioned the economists Dawson and Sita earlier, the American economists. They assessed the growth in bureaucracy in the US from roughly the 1950s onwards, 1952 or something like that. I don't remember exactly. Now, the issue with that is you're dealing with a historical counterfactual, and that is always difficult. It's always going to throw out a lot of alternative ideas about what could have happened, and of course there have been good regulations implemented since 1950. It's difficult to say just every single regulation implemented has been a negative. So that, although it's useful, that approach does have its deficiencies. Another way of doing it is to, let's say, take a really libertarian approach and just say, well, all regulation is just pure cost. That also has some problems. It's going to raise no end of objections. Now, that approach will sound quite wacky to a lot of people, but it's worth just thinking about, let's say, Switzerland as an example. In the 19th century and much of the 20th century, it really was very close to a very libertarian state and was always one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But nevertheless, I think that approach also has its limitations. So what we really want to do is compare our current regulatory structure to something like a best practice. And two ways of doing that are to look at countries which we can assess now as best practice, and also we can take a theoretical approach about what it might be in the abstract. Now, an issue with that is, again, you'll always have people saying, no, that's wrong. People can argue endlessly about what a theoretically best structure for regulation is. If we take specific countries and treat them as best practice countries, that's often the easiest way of doing this. And one of the countries that is always close to the top or at the top of these league tables for regulatory best practice is Singapore. So if you look at the World Bank league table of the Ease of Doing Business Index, the OECD metrics, think tanks like the Fraser Institute, Singapore always does very well. And so if we focus on that as an example, when Singapore became independent in the early 60s, the GDP per capita in Singapore was roughly the same as it was in Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. It essentially had the same levels of prosperity as sub-Saharan Africa. And now Singapore has a GDP per capita of well over $90,000 a year. So that's roughly double what it is in most countries in Western Europe. And in fact, it's still growing. And I mentioned the number of unicorns, for instance, in Singapore. That's a strong indicator that perhaps they could even double again their prosperity over the next generation. They may well be 3 or 4 times as wealthy as the average European country in another generation or so, if this continues. So that is if we want to focus on really bringing best practice into Europe in terms of regulations, that's a strong approach, is to look at countries that we can use as examples. I mean, another one in Europe that's always been quite a good example, which I mentioned, is Switzerland, which is obviously also one of the wealthiest countries in the world. They've tended to have a very pro-business approach, and as a consequence of that, have done very well. So, if we conclude today, then there are a few points which we need to understand if we're going to get the European economy growing again, at least from a regulatory perspective. The first one is we really need to seriously assess the cost of all of this bureaucracy, because the way the European Commission does this is laughably simplistic, and even then it's very low compared to any realistic assessment. The cost of bureaucracy is not just the cost of people sitting around filling forms. As we saw from the German studies, even then, actually a significant percentage of employees' time is spent on this. But there are all kinds of knock-ons in terms of entrepreneurs moving abroad, entrepreneurs just deciding not to go ahead with business ventures, companies deciding to shift resources into relatively low regulatory areas, and so on. And I've talked through the consequences of this today. Really, Europe just has an extraordinarily stagnant economy. Small countries like South Korea are producing more tech giants like Samsung and so on than essentially every country in Europe put together. It's quite sad, really, when you think about what Europe should be achieving. So the first thing to do is to accurately assess the cost of bureaucracy. The cost of bureaucracy is not just the direct cost of people filling out forms, it's all of these other things that I talked about. Second of all, when the cost of regulations are assessed, in Europe and Britain, again, I'm not just picking on the EU, they tend to assess the incremental cost of each additional regulation. What they really need to do is assess the total cost of all accumulated regulations. That is really where all of this comes from. It's years and years and hundreds of thousands of regulations that just swamp everything. And with that in mind, then, in best practice countries like Singapore, to a certain extent Switzerland, there's more of a focus on repealing previous bureaucracy. It's really a continuous effort to achieve this. And in order to achieve this, there has to be a lot of discussion with business. Now, here in Brussels and in London and in Washington, for that matter, when politicians talk about speaking to business, what they often mean is big business and very wealthy people. There needs to be far more discussions with smaller businesses as well, because that's really where the growth comes from over the medium to long term. And as I noted earlier, a lot of these regulatory costs are relatively flat costs across the economy. So relatively speaking, small businesses are the ones that suffer the most from this. I think there's now so much bureaucracy in Europe, you could massively cut it down. There's nothing but benefit essentially from just getting rid of lots and lots of this bureaucracy. You know, in economics it's said there's no such thing as a free lunch. In this case, I think getting rid of a lot of this bureaucracy is essentially just a free lunch for the European economy. And just as another interesting point, it's interesting that with the war in Ukraine, that seems to have focused minds more in here in Brussels and in London on getting the European economy moving again. And it's often these outside threats that can actually prompt these things. Absurdly, it's completely absurd. It just appears to be a part of human nature that we've now just got used to this stagnation. I think it's even quite psychological. I think Europeans, including British, have almost internalized now that when you buy a mobile phone, it's either South Korean or Chinese or American. You know, there's no ambition left in Europe now. No one thinks of this idea that we should have European companies competing with Samsung and Apple. And so I think that, but that would hopefully change if we did indeed get rid of a lot of this regulation. So I hope that's given a reasonably good assessment of where we are today in Europe and some thoughts on how we can get the European economy back growing again. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Max. So yeah, now the floor is yours. So please, if you want to ask a question,